Norman sat in the kitchen, blankly staring at the cold coffee he had forgotten to drink hours ago. Bills piled up on the table, and his phone kept buzzing with reminders about the meeting with his wife's lawyer. The divorce was drawing closer, and each day pushed him further into despair. Just as he sank deeper into his thoughts, the phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar. He ignored it at first, but the calls kept coming, persistent and nagging. After the fourth ring, Norman gave in and answered. A voice crackled through the receiver, one he hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly. "Hey, Norman. Long time no see," the voice said casually. It was Rick, the same Rick he used to call a friend, the one who had vanished from his life over a decade ago. Norman's chest tightened. The last he'd heard of Rick, the man was mixed up in some bad business and had to flee town. Norman tried to stay polite, hoping to cut the conversation short, but Rick wasn't letting him off the hook so easily. "I've got a proposition for you," Rick said, his voice laced with something unsettling. "Sounds like you could use it right about now." The words hit Norman like a slap in the face. How did Rick know about his situation? A chill ran down his spine. Rick suggested they meet at the old bar they used to hang out at. Norman hesitated. Nothing good could come from meeting Rick again, he knew that. But the thought of his wife sitting across from a smug lawyer, tallying alimony payments, while his bank account bled dry haunted him. And so, against his better judgment, he gave in. That evening, Norman walked into the bar. It hadn't changed a bit. Dim lighting, the smell of old wood, and cigarette smoke that seemed woven into the very fabric of the place. Rick was waiting in the corner, looking different, sharp suit, expensive watch, and a confidence in his every move that hadn't been there before. As soon as Norman sat down, Rick ordered 2 whiskeys and got straight to the point. "I heard you need some cash," Rick said with a sly grin. Norman gave a grim nod, unwilling to spill his problems to Rick. Rick smirked like he already knew everything without being told. "There's a job. Nothing too complicated, but it's risky. One trip, and your problems disappear." Norman squinted, suspicious. "And if I say no?" Rick's grin widened, but there was no warmth in it anymore. "You can try, but let's be honest. You need this more than I do." Rick laid out the plan. Norman had to drive a van from one city to another overnight. No stops, no questions. 15 grand would be waiting for him as soon as the delivery was done. Norman began to ask questions, but Rick cut him off. "This ain't some big scam, buddy. Just drop off the cargo. If anyone asks, you don't know a thing." A knot tightened in Norman's chest. Sounded too easy, and that made it all the more dangerous. He sat in silence for a moment, weighing his options. But Rick wasn't giving him time to think. "You've already made the right choice," Rick said, standing up. "Be at the warehouse lot outside town by 10, and don't be late." Before leaving, Rick leaned in close, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "And one more thing, if anything goes wrong, that's your problem." "Got it." Norman sat alone at the table, his mind a storm of doubts, fear, and anger. He knew he'd just stepped into something he couldn't back out of. A path leading into the unknown, one that might not have a way back. But it was too late to stop now. The night draped the city in a heavy blanket of darkness as Norman pulled into the abandoned loading dock just outside town. The streetlights were out, and the only source of light was the flicker of his headlights. At the far end of the lot, a van stood motionless, like a ghost waiting in the shadows. Its engine was humming softly, as if it had been expecting him all along. Norman walked toward it, his anxiety growing with every step, though he tried to calm himself. "Just a couple of hours and it'll all be over," he repeated in his head. Standing next to the van was Rick, smoking a cigarette. He didn't waste words, just gave a nod toward the driver's seat and flashed that same predatory grin. "Drive straight, no stops, no questions, and you'll be fine." A chill settled deep in Norman's chest, but he climbed into the driver's seat anyway. As the van rolled off the lot, the frame swayed slightly, and the metal body creaked, as if something heavy shifted inside. Norman forced himself to ignore it. His job was simple: deliver the cargo to its destination. The miles on the odometer slowly ticked upward, and the road stretched endlessly through dark forests and deserted highways. The hum of the engine was steady, but Norman's nerves refused to settle. Everything felt too quiet, too off. In the rearview mirror, a black SUV appeared, keeping a steady distance behind him. At first, Norman thought it was just a coincidence, but the SUV stayed in sight, shadowing him mile after mile. He pressed the gas pedal slightly, but the vehicle behind matched his speed. A cold sweat trickled down his spine. He floored it, but the SUV stuck close, making no attempt to overtake him. This wasn't a coincidence. Norman's hand shook as he grabbed his phone and called Rick. The line barely rang before Rick answered, as if he'd been waiting for the call. "It's all good, Norman," Rick said calmly when Norman nervously mentioned the tale. "Just keep driving. Don't worry about it." Rick's voice was too nonchalant, as if the situation was perfectly normal. That unsettling calm rattled Norman even more. Something about Rick's tone felt wrong. Then Norman heard it, a rustling sound from inside the van. It wasn't just the frame creaking from the motion of the vehicle. It sounded like someone, or something, moving behind him. A wave of panic hit him, and without thinking, he veered off the road, pulling over in the middle of the dark highway. The engine sputtered to a stop, and silence swallowed everything. The black SUV also slowed, coming to a halt at a distance, as if waiting. Norman jumped out of the driver's seat, sucking in gulps of cold night air. His heart pounded as he walked to the back of the van, hesitating for a moment before gripping the lock. "It's just cargo," he told himself. But what if it wasn't? His hands shook as he unlatched the door. With a groan, the doors swung open, and the glow from a distant streetlight spilled into the van. What he saw inside would haunt him forever. Lying on the cold metal floor, bound and gagged, was a young woman. Her eyes, wide with tears and fear, locked onto his. She thrashed desperately, trying to say something, but the duct tape over her mouth silenced her. Her eyes pleaded with him, as if he was her last chance at salvation. The air seemed to leave Norman's lungs in a rush. His mind swirled in chaos. Who was she? How had she ended up here? He knelt beside her, frantically tearing the tape from her mouth. As soon as it came off, she gasped, speaking in a hoarse, frantic whisper. "Please, help me. They're coming. We don't have much time." Her voice trembled, broken by fear and exhaustion. Before Norman could fully grasp the meaning of her words, she leaned closer, her whisper sharp and urgent. "You don't understand. They won't stop. If we don't leave now, they'll kill you too." Norman stood in front of the open van, staring at the girl gasping for air, her body trembling with fear. Her eyes were filled with despair and silent pleas, as if every passing second might cost her life. His mind was spinning, tangled in a nightmare he couldn't make sense of. Her words, "They won't stop," hung in the air like an invisible noose tightening around his neck. He didn't have a plan, but one thing became clear. Leaving her here would be a death sentence. The phone in his pocket buzzed sharply, snapping him back to reality. It was Rick. Norman exhaled, trying to steady himself, but his fingers shook as he answered the call. "What's going on? Why did you stop?" Rick's voice was low, but there was a dangerous tension beneath the calm. Norman fought back the panic rising in his chest. Something's up with the van. Maybe a breakdown?" he stammered, grasping for an excuse, unsure if it sounded convincing. There was a brief, heavy silence on the line. Then Rick spoke with unsettling coldness. "You're being tracked. If you go off route or try anything stupid, they won't just find you, they'll find your family too. Stick to the plan, and everything will be fine." The call ended abruptly, leaving Norman with a ringing sense of doom echoing in his ears. Liz, who had silently watched the conversation unfold, whispered bitterly, "You don't get it. They've got everything under control. If you deliver me, they'll kill us both. It's just a matter of time." Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of someone who had seen death up close. Norman's mind raced. How could they escape? Run? But how? He darted around the van, searching frantically for anything that might give them a way out. Then he spotted it, a small, inconspicuous device tucked under the chassis. A GPS tracker blinking with a red light. His heart pounded in his chest. They already knew where he was. Any move he made would be noticed. Time was running out. Norman sprinted back to Liz, frustration and desperation twisting his voice. "Damn it! They're tracking us." Liz just shook her head, as if that had been obvious from the start. "It's all part of their game," she said, struggling to sit up, though her legs were still tied too tightly. "You're just another puppet to them. But if you do what they want, we won't make it." Norman glanced back at the road. The black SUV was still there, parked at a distance with its headlights off. They weren't rushing. They knew fear would do the job for them. A cold, creeping terror gripped him. Whatever choice he made now would change his life forever. The thought sent a wave of dread through him, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. Now wasn't the time to freeze. Suddenly, a plan began to form in his mind. He ripped the tape off Liz's wrists as quickly as he could. She winced but tried to help him. "What are you doing?" she asked, breathless. "We're getting out of here. Fast," Norman said, determination settling into his voice. They couldn't stay with the van, it was a death trap. Their only shot was to ditch it and run into the forest, where the trackers would only have rough coordinates to follow. It was a gamble, but staying meant a bullet to the head. Norman and Liz ran through the forest, their feet slipping on branches and fallen leaves. Every sound felt threatening. The snap of twigs, the rustling leaves, even the wind whispering briskly through the trees. Liz stumbled as she tried to stay on her feet, but Norman forced himself not to think about what might happen if they stopped. Suddenly, Liz halted and pointed to an old, abandoned ranger's cabin hidden among the trees. "There! We need to hide!" she shouted, and without hesitation, Norman led her toward it. Inside, the stench of decay and dust filled their lungs, suffocating them. Liz leaned her back against the wall, trying to catch her breath, while Norman kept watch. Her face was pale, her wide eyes filled with fear. "I knew they had connections, but I didn't think it would come to this," she whispered, clenching her hands. She dropped her head, her voice barely audible. "I was taken because I know too much about a crime syndicate. The other girls who knew the truth, they're already dead." Her words echoed ominously in Norman's mind, just as his phone began ringing again. Liz closed her eyes, bracing for more bad news. The caller ID was unknown. Norman hesitated but answered, pressing the phone to his ear. A cold, dreadful voice came through. "You have a choice. If you don't bring her, we'll come for your family. There's only one way out, her or them." The world seemed to tilt beneath Norman's feet, his heart freezing for a moment. He was paralyzed, unable to think clearly, knowing there was no turning back now. Any logical solution felt distant and out of reach. He glanced at Liz, who stood silently in the corner, her face a mask of fear. She knew what kind of threat he'd just received, and the knowledge only deepened her terror. His eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for a solution, but nothing gave him any relief. "I can't sacrifice your life to save my family," he muttered, though his words felt more like a question than a firm statement. Liz, sensing his turmoil, tried to reassure him. "Don't think about me. I don't weigh as much as your family. But if they find out you let me die, it'll be worse. I know you're not that kind of person." Norman's chest tightened as fear consumed him. Time was running out. Should he risk everything to try and save Liz? Or follow through to protect his family, the way they demanded? The decision felt like a noose tightening around him. "We need to get out of here," he said, forcing himself to stay focused. "If we stay any longer, they'll find us." Liz lifted her head and exhaled deeply, understanding they were running out of time. They stepped back into the unknown, ready for anything, but with the shadow of terror trailing closely behind, waiting to pull them under. Norman, his heart heavy with anxiety, was desperately trying to save Liz, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his family. Suddenly, his phone rang, and what appeared on the screen filled him with dread. He opened the video, And there they were, his wife and child, bound on the cold floor of a grim warehouse. Their eyes, wide with fear, reflected the terror consuming them, and Norman felt the ground give way beneath him. It was a horrific sight. His wife sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face, clutching a phone that played the same video. Only this time, it was Norman who seemed to surrender. She sobbed, pleading for help. Just then, a masked man appeared. Holding a knife, he taunted them with a sinister smile, dragging the cold steel across her skin to scare her. Norman clenched his eyes shut, trying in vain to block out the nightmare. The man leaned closer to the camera, explaining his plan in a calm, terrifying voice. He pressed the knife to her ear, saying he wanted Norman to witness what happens to those who cross him. He traced the blade along her neck, causing her to shudder in terror. Norman's mind spiraled as he thought of how everything had gone so wrong. His hopes shattered, leaving him trapped in this waking nightmare. When the first cut was made, his wife screamed in agony. Norman felt his world collapse around him. The man on the video wasn't rushing, he was savoring the moment. With a wicked grin, the knife glinted in his hand as he inflicted wound after wound, leaving no room for hope. Something inside Norman broke. He knew he was losing everything. His family, his entire world, and there was no one left to help him. In her final moments, his wife locked eyes with the camera, her gaze full of fear and sorrow, until the screen went silent. The video ended, and Norman collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down his face. He had lost everything. She was his everything, and now that she was gone, he was left alone, drowning in the abyss of cruelty that had ensnared him. He realized he had gambled with their lives, and the cost was unbearable. The sound of footsteps jarred him back to the moment. Rick stood in the doorway, pointing a gun at Liz. She trembled, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "You've come this far, Norman," Rick sneered. "But this is where it ends." He pressed the gun's barrel to Liz's temple. Norman felt something snap inside him, panic flooding his mind as he scrambled to think of a way to protect her. His last chance to save what little remained. "Let her go, Rick," Norman shouted, trying to keep his voice steady despite the storm raging within. "She doesn't know anything. There's no reason for this." "Run, Norman," Rick taunted with a mocking grin. "Or do you want to watch her die? Don't think you can stop me." Liz sobbed uncontrollably. "Help me. No. Please, help me." Norman couldn't take it anymore. Fury ignited in his eyes as he lunged forward, but before he could reach Rick, guards emerged from both sides, blocking his way. They tackled Norman to the ground, pinning him down. Rick threw his head back and laughed. "How much are you willing to lose for her, Norman?" But Norman wouldn't quit. He fought with everything he had, wrestling against the guards holding him down. In a moment of chaos, one guard's gun slipped from his holster, and Norman seized it. Rick's expression twisted as he tightened his grip on his own gun, pressing it harder against Liz's head. "If you pull that trigger, you'll never know what happens to her." Adrenaline surged through Norman. He broke free from the guards, charged at Rick, and delivered a punch to his gut. Rick stumbled, giving Norman just enough time to fire. The shot rang out, and Rick collapsed to the floor, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Blood pooled beneath him. Liz rushed to Norman, tears streaming down her face. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and relief, but then her expression shifted. She began to clap slowly, her voice turning cold and sinister. "You saved me," she whispered, her tone thick with malice. "You shouldn't have done that, but now things will be different." Norman's heart sank as Liz turned toward the guards, who were now standing at attention by the exit. "You're free to go," she told them with a smile. "Have a good evening." The same guards who had just tried to kill her now obeyed her commands without question. Norman's mind reeled, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. "You have no idea who I really am, Norman," Liz continued, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm not some helpless victim. I run this game. Rick was a nuisance. I've wanted him gone for a while, but I couldn't figure out how. Until now." Norman's head spun as the weight of her words sank in. He realized, too late, that he had been nothing more than a pawn in her twisted plan, a puppet dancing to her every whim. Weeks later, Norman awoke in a prison cell, sentenced for Rick's murder. The walls closed in around him, and the weight of his choices crushed his spirit. As he sat in the corner of his cell, the final blow came, a letter from the police. His wife and child had been found dead. Liz had left behind enough evidence to frame him for their deaths. Norman sat in silence, broken and hollow, as guilt gnawed at his soul. His heart, torn apart by loss and betrayal, would never find peace. Even in his dreams, he couldn't escape the nightmare of what had happened. Every moment haunted him, a constant reminder of the terrible price he had paid. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And remember, trust no one but yourself.